So next we have Ryan Chenkie. Ryan is a JavaScript consultant, also Google developer expert. You guys know what those are, right? He means he knows something. So he's the Google developer expert in Angular, right?
Angular, web tech, and identity as well.
Oh, a lot of things. Oh, identity, of course, yes.
Yes.
From Auth0 experience.
The Auth0 days, yes.
Yeah. I met Ryan a few years ago when I was in the plane boarding for NGConf for last year.
That's right. That is how we met.
Yes, and I saw Ryan and his wife and the young kid all going to Salt Lake City. Yeah, I was like, and I saw the shirt that he had. It was like NGConf shirt, but that NGConf shirt was a green one, I think.
Yes.
That was like one of the first.
One of the originals.
Yes, the original. I was like, oh, I know where you're going. He's like, yeah, there. So Ryan's going to talk about Angular beyond the front end. Give it up for Ryan.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I've traveled the incredibly long distance from Ottawa to be with you. That's where I'm based. And like Alex said, my name is Ryan Chenkie. I'm a Google developer expert, JavaScript consultant, and I work mostly with things like Angular, React, Node, and GraphQL. That's my stack, I guess I would say, these days. And the question that I would have for you today is, well, first of all, are you a full stack developer? Hands up if you would say you're a full stack developer. Okay, great. And second of all, are you doing JavaScript on the front and back? Hands up if you're doing that. Okay, so fewer of us. And then the question that I would have you maybe think about is, how do we choose a backend if we are considering ourselves mainly primarily front-end developers, but also do backend, and so therefore we're full stack? What goes into this decision to actually choose a backend? I think a lot of us might suffer from this ordeal where we are a full stack developer in the sense that we know one ends of that stack very well, but maybe the other side not as well. And I think that there are some ways, especially for Angular developers, like many of us in this room would be, that we can leverage some tools that are kind of newer in the ecosystem to help us be better all-around full-stack developers. And the one that I want to talk to you today is one that's going to help us to do that on the back end, and that's called Nest.js. And Nest allows us to, I would say, expand Angular's capabilities. So if we look at the front-end side, we've got things in Angular that we know and love, things like modules. We wrap up bits of logic, bits of application feature code, and we can shuffle it around throughout our application or other applications. We wrap things up into components. Angular's got a very nice component model. Dependency injection, a long-time loved feature of Angular. Things like services and routing, all done for us with Angular. But then when we go to the back-end side, those kinds of things aren't always there for us, especially if we're doing things from scratch. There's lots of frameworks around that'll do similar things. But if you want to take kind of almost a one-to-one mapping, as so far as you can, from the front end to the back end, it's hard to find something that's going to do that. The good news is, and we'll talk to you tonight about, is this framework called Nest.js, which gives us these things. And the reason it gives us these things is because it's heavily inspired by Angular. So the creator of Nest.js, Camille, said, I want to have a backend that is very similar in its design approach to Angular and has a lot of the same features that we know and love from Angular. Things like modules, things like controllers, which kind of are analogous to components. If you consider things as like a first entry point into an application in some sense, you can consider components and controllers to be similar. Nest has a dependency injection system, services and routing, and it looks an awful lot like Angular does. So maybe we take a little bit of a step back and think about why Angular in the first place. So in general, I think we've got some things like this, right? If you're part of an enterprise, you might choose Angular because it's opinionated. You can have multiple different teams who are working independently that are producing code that looks very similar. It's prescriptive. You're guided through how to do things. The way to lay out an application is sort of, you're guided along in that sense, right from the beginning. And it's a very supportive community, very supportive framework in terms of documentation and all that. If we think about tech-specific things, we get TypeScript by default. Now, a question for the audience, who was doing TypeScript before Angular came along? Anybody? A couple people. Not many. And I suspect that a lot of people who are now doing TypeScript, many of them could be Angular developers, and perhaps they got into it solely because Angular sort of pushed them into it. We're at a point in time now where TypeScript is becoming more and more popular, so maybe people would get there eventually. But I think Angular really pushed a lot of people into using TypeScript, and I think for the better, ultimately. And so TypeScript is something that Angular is opinionated about in the same way that Nest is as well. We get the CLI with Angular. We get a CLI with Nest.js. Works in a very similar way. And all around, just a standard way of doing things technically. So, like I've been mentioning, Nest carries over this kind of general and tech-specific model from Angular to a back-end framework. And it knows about the things that we might want to do. It anticipates many of the decisions we might need to make as back-end application developers for us. It anticipates these things and helps to guide us along to achieve them. So some common server needs for thinking about applications on the server. We might need to delay the server application start so that we can call it to a database, make connections elsewhere. We might need to delay that, and we get something like this, something to do this with Nest called async providers. We get a middleware, a nice middleware layer so that we can interpret incoming requests, maybe run some logic on them, maybe kick back a 401 if somebody's unauthorized, things like that. We get a nice middleware layer. A really clean way of communicating with databases, a prescriptive way of doing that, and a very nice ORM as well. So that's a lot of talk about Nest. I think it would make best sense if we just went in and did some code. So I think what we'll do is we will kick up a very simple Nest application. So I mentioned we've got the Nest CLI. And it works very similarly to how the Angular CLI does. We would do a global install of Nest.js/CLI to get it. So if you're starting out, you would just do a global install like this, Nest.js/CLI, similar to how you've got Angular/CLI. This might take a sec, and since not that bad. I was going to say, since I've got it anyway, we could just use what I've got. But nonetheless, to start up an application, a fresh application, in the same way that you would do ng new, you could do ng or nest new. Let's call this maybe ng Toronto. Beautiful. I think that's because I had a demo app with a similar name that was, thank you. Let's try this. It's going to be an app that talks about users. So we'll call it ng Toronto users. First thing we get is whether or not we want to use npm or yarn. I am still using npm. Anybody using yarn these days? A few of us. I don't know if too many people in the community are still using it. It seems like it got really hot, and then maybe npm reached maybe feature parity or something, and so it's back in prime time. But this will install all the dependencies that we need for this application. But we do get the choice of package manager that we would want to use. So we'll let this run. And we see we've got successfully created projects. So let's cd into it, ng Toronto users. I'll bring that up in VS Code. Let me zoom in here. And the first thing that we can take a look at is the directory structure here. So we get a source directory right off the bat. Looks similar to what we get in an Angular application. And we've got some files that are similar in their look to an Angular application as well. So the first one we might look at is this app module. So if you were to just maybe take a quick pass at this, you might just assume this is Angular code because it looks very similar, right? We've got the module decorator here with an imports array, controllers, providers. Now this controllers bit, it's a bit different. In the Nest side, we call them controllers, kind of analogous again to components in the Angular side. So that looks kind of similar to Angular. We've got a controller here. Again, looks similar to an Angular component perhaps. So why don't we see what we can do since our backend applications are mainly about serving up endpoints that can respond to requests. Let's see how we can get some requests going. So we've got a couple different ways that we can run this application. If we look in the package.json file here, we've got some scripts that are ready for us to go to start the app. It's on TypeScript, so we've got things like tsnode, we've got a tsc watch command that we can use. And so let's do npm run start dev. And that will hopefully serve up the application for us. And then we can just go into, I've got Insomnia here. Let's go to localhost 3000. And we get this hello world message. So how is that working? If we go into our controller file here, we've got this method called getHello, which is reaching into a service, getting just a simple string message. And the reason that it's responding to a GET request is because we are decorating it with the GET decorator. So this decorator sets the method beneath it up to be able to respond to whatever kind of request that we want. So, for example, if instead we wanted this particular endpoint to respond to a post request, we could change it up there, and then we'd get it responding to a post request like that. So we've got these decorators. We've got get, post, put, delete, everything that we would expect, right? Okay, so let's take a look at the CLI here, some of the tooling we've got. So let's say this is an application that's going to deal with users. Let's say we wanted to set up maybe one of our resources, which we call our users resource. The first thing that we might do is generate a module for it. So we could do nest, G for generate. We'd want a module called users. So we run that command, and all of a sudden we've got this users module. If we take a look at what's inside, all that we've got so far is this users module TS file. So it's not doing anything crucial yet, but one thing to take note of is that, like we might expect, we need to, if we want to use this module, we need to grab it in our main application module, and we need to import it. And Nest actually takes care of that for us. So as soon as we generate it, it gets imported into the main application module. Okay, so if we want to make this do something, we're going to need maybe a controller for it, right? For that, we can do nest, G for generate. We'll want a controller, and we'll call that users. And we've got our controller file, and much like what happened just a second ago, we get that controller imported for us into the users module so that everything within this module can now be exposed at our top level for us. Okay, so users controller. Let's see what we can do here. Well, the first thing maybe to point out is that in this controller, we're passing in a string of users. In this one, we've got nothing. And the reason is that whatever we pass in here is going to be a URL segment that we've got to tack onto a request to hit this specific endpoint. So the way that you might construct these controllers is you'd have like, if you consider your application broken up into resources, I usually think in terms of like nouns, like users or reports or invoices, that sort of thing. If you want to create sort of like full CRUD control for these, you might set up a controller for them, right? So you might have all of your CRUD controls right here in this users controller. So we could do something like a get request, which responds to get users. Let's return just a string for now. We'll say, hey, users. So now, if we go to /users, oh, that's post. Get, there we go. So we've got our users string coming back. Something that we might also want to do is a specific, like a specific resource, users resource, like user1, for example. We're passing in a string, a specific string to this get decorator here. And so we can do users1. The way we would make this dynamic, because hard coding doesn't help us a whole lot here, is we use the colon. So we can use the colon and set maybe a parameter that we'd be expecting. In this case, it'd be called ID. And to make use of this, or to reach out to this parameter to be able to interpret it, I suppose, we need a new decorator called param. So let's import that. And that decorator sits in front of the parameter going into this method that we might call user ID, something like that. Just put an any on it for now. And so then what we've got is user ID. Actually, what I'll do is call this user because it's going to be user ID like that. User 4, 5, etc. So we can make use of params very easily. What else can we do? If you have a post request, if you are passing in data, the way that Nest likes you to set things up, so what they recommend, I'm just going to return a string, return user created. They like you to set up a class to sort of put a type on whatever your input is going to be, your payload. So, and what they say, refer to it as a data transfer object. So create user DTO is what we might do. And we might have like first name as a string, last name, string, that sort of thing. And this is getting a little bit busy with the yellow squigglies, but what we could do is we could ask for the body decorator here, and we would ask for that payload by putting the type of create user DTO here, and then maybe let's just log it. Something like that. Let's see if we can get that logged out. So what we can do is do a post request that goes to users and send in some JSON. First name, John. Last name, Doe, that sort of thing. User created, and there we have the payload. Now, one thing to note, we've got this class here with our the types of the individual properties that might be on a payload that comes in. But there wouldn't be anything at this point stopping someone from putting another property on and that making its way in. So there it is. It comes through, even though age isn't on that class. And so it's important to realize that this doesn't sort of give you payload validation. There is a whole layer for that within Nest. So you've got payload validation capabilities, but it's not going to be here on your DTO. Rather, this is a class for you to be able to type your objects within your application. Okay, so that's a post request. One of the really cool things that I'll show you here is how Nest sort of anticipates that we might need, the way that we might need to make use of async type of things, right? So common thing we would need to do is have a request come to our server, then we would make some kind of HTTP request out to some other service, wait for that, get the data back, manipulate it, whatever, right? So Nest anticipates that, of course, and gives us a good layer over top of Axios. So many of us have probably heard of Axios, a very nice HTTP library for the front end and the back end. And Nest provides kind of a wrapper around that. But more so than just wrapping Axios, it helps us to take care of observables as well. So let's see one thing you can do here. So if you did, let's say we have a GET request, and we'll go out and get some GitHub users. So we'll call this gh-users. So get GitHub users will be our method. And the way that Nest handles things here for us is all based on the return type that we're going to put on this method. And in particular, if we put a return type of observable, so that brought in observable from Rx, and then we say it's going to be an Axios response, if we type it as such, and put in array there. If we say that that's going to be the return type, Nest is going to do some really cool stuff to subscribe for us and then respond from this method we're creating with whatever data we get once, once we're subscribed and we get a result back. So what we might do is, well, first of all, we have to pull in the HTTP service. So pull it in like that. And because we've got dependency injection, just like we do with our Angular applications, we can inject our HTTP service right here into our constructor. So via the DI system, we get HTTP service. And then we can say this HTTP service get, and we could go to api.github.com/users. And we could send that back. Now, I know it's really busy with all the yellow warnings, but this right here wouldn't really work for us, and that's because Axios, when you make a request with it, it's going to send everything back on an object that has things other than just the data that you might be requesting. So it's got your data on a data key, but it also has other information about your request. But we can take care of that if we use the map operator. So let's import map from our XJS operators. And we will pipe in a map. We just want to take the response and basically say, give me the data that is on the data key, essentially. All right, what's our error? Oh, thank you very much. Dependencies. So I forgot to include the HTTP module here. So much like we would need to include an HTTP module in Angular, you know what, just plop this up here. We have to do the same thing here with Nest. So HTTP module, put it on our imports array, just like that. Now we should be good to go. So let's try it. Get request to GitHub users. Cannot get GitHub users. What are we doing wrong here? What's that? Oh, yes, thank you very much. The audience is astute. And I think I know what I did there. I've still got this one here that's looking for an ID. So, you know, position matters when we're thinking about our segments, how we break them down. This one, we're expecting only one request that would come to a segment setup of users / something. So I get rid of this one. And if we cross our fingers, we now get our GitHub users. So again, the important thing here is that a lot of the magic of observables, if you will, is taken care of for us with Nest, just based on typing the return as a certain type. So, quick crash introduction to how Nest works, how you can create an application with it. And I'll head back over to the slides here. And answer some questions about that often come up with regards to how do I start using Nest if we've already got, you know, an organization that's got a big back end, but we like the looks of Nest. What do we do? And there are a few different ways you might approach it. So if you're at a company that's using Node on the back end, and especially if you're using something like Express or Fastify, there is this HTTP adapter that you get with Nest, which allows you to sort of create things side by side in some ways, but then within your Nest application, you can sort of make use of your existing code. Another approach, if you're not using either of those two, is you can extract common business logic from your existing application, create your Nest application, then share that code between. And if you're using something else, like if you're using .NET or PHP or something else completely, the only real thing you can do to kind of mix them together is some kind of reverse proxy setup with a slow migration, unfortunately. But it is worth your while, I would say. These are some companies that are using Nest that we know of, that's made publicly available. I only recognize, I think, 2 from here, if I'm honest. Valor and Adidas. I don't know that I've seen these other ones. But there are companies using it. We know because we have logos. There are more reports of who's using it at this issue, if you're interested at all to see who's using it out in the wild. But Camille, who created the framework, assures me that there are many more companies using it that just can't make it known that they are. Okay, that's about it. So slides are here, bit.ly/nestjs-angular. If you've got any questions at all, I'm around all night. I will take questions now, though, if we have some time. I don't know.
Yep.
We got the mic?
Yep.
Yeah, let's do questions.
Actually, we are using Nest. You mentioned databases, but we use Connex. We use another framework for the database from Nest, and I just want to ask if it makes sense to have another one.
Another which?
Like Connex, K-N-E-X.
If it makes sense to use another database, or?
Another framework.
Or
We
another
have
framework.
Nest, yeah.
I'm not sure if it makes sense. It would depend, really, I suppose, on
Yeah.
your setup and
Okay, so I will
your
double
goals.
check when I come back then.
Sure, yeah.
Which web server runtime does it run on?
Web server runtime?
Yeah, like
So
Express or?
you can use Express. You've got options for Express or Fastify. And there may be more in the works, but it defaults you to Express, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's all Express underneath the layer that Nest puts on top.
Any other questions?
Can you use the same node libraries for this Nest?
The same node libraries?
Yeah.
Do you mean just like any kind of
Like
node package?
for database connection or for logging or for connecting to different, like there's a lot of node libraries for
Right.
the backend, especially with that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you can use any node library you would want. I don't know of any cases where certain node libraries would conflict with maybe some of your like Nest itself or some of the Nest code that you would write. I don't know of any cases like that. But if you've got a node library that you can drop into an Express application, presumably you can just drop it into your Nest application as well. Should work.
Thank you.
So I got a question in regards to like OAuth authentication. Would that work in the same way because you'll be using TypeScript with that and it might give errors?
Yeah, TypeScript wouldn't have a bearing on the OAuth flow, really. I mean, TypeScript would more so be an implementation detail on the developer side. But you would probably want to go with one of the prescriptive OAuth kind of transactional things that Nest gives you. At least in terms of, they've got a setup for that. But you can use things like Passport or like, if you're using a third-party provider like Auth0, for example, you can still do that within your Nest application.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
All right, thank you so much, Ryan.
Yeah, and so, Twitter is here for me. But yeah, if there's any other questions, I'll be around.
Yeah, they were pretty easy on you.
Yeah.